How many
How
shifts
many
would it
shifts
take
would
you
it
to
take you
afford
to
shoes
afford
like
shoes
mine?
like mine?
Billionaire Elizabeth Vance asked, drawing nervous laughter
You
from her
nine down.
guests. All evening, she had mocked Marcus Cole, a black single
I
father
mean,
working
look
as
at
a
that
waiter,
uniform.
for his
He's
uniform,
confidence for
his
a
age,
waiter.
and the way he spoke with too much
Enjoy your
confidence
evening,
for
madam.
someone in his position. But when Elizabeth
Does
asked
your
whether his
10-year-old daughter
10-year-old
feel
daughter felt
ashamed of you?
ashamed of him, Marcus slowly set down the wine bottle. Mock me
Mock
again,
me again.
he said. I dare
I
you.
dare you.
Elizabeth smiled, until Marcus quietly named the 3 hidden flaws her billion-dollar platform had spent
Your
3 months
platform
trying
has
to
3
bury.
hidden flaws.
Within seconds, the most powerful woman in the room had nothing left to say. If a story like this keeps you hooked, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because what happens between Marcus and Elizabeth only gets more intense from here. The gilded fork smelled like candle wax and old money. Marcus Cole had learned a long time ago how to walk through that smell without letting it drag up memories he'd worked hard to bury. He carried a bottle of Cabernet toward table 9 with the same steady rhythm he brought to every table, every night, for 3 years straight. It was the same rhythm that had made him the best waiter on staff. Not because he memorized wine pairings, but because he remembered names. Guests' names, their kids' names, their anniversaries. His manager, Tony Reyes, used to joke that Marcus could disarm a rude customer with nothing but patience and a straight face. The other servers always asked him the same thing. How do you stay so calm when everyone else is losing it? He never had a complicated answer. Attention, patience, and not measuring his worth by what people assumed the moment they saw his uniform. What none of them knew, what Marcus rarely let himself think about during a shift, was that the man pouring their wine had once built software that ran billion-dollar companies. 7 years ago, Marcus was the co-founder and lead engineer of Nexbridge Systems, a supply chain forecasting platform so advanced that competitors spent years trying to reverse engineer it. He built the core architecture himself, the part that let the whole system bend instead of break when markets shifted without warning. Then his daughter Zoe, 3 years old at the time, was diagnosed with a heart defect that needed emergency surgery. Insurance covered part of it. Not enough. So Marcus sold his equity, his entire company, for a fraction of what it was worth, signing the papers in a hospital conference room while his wife Denise held his hand and a surgeon waited 2 floors up. He never regretted it. Zoe lived. She grew. She learned to ride a bike. She turned 10 years old in the small Brooklyn apartment Marcus still called home. 3 years ago, Denise lost her own fight with illness. Since then, Marcus had raised his daughter alone, trading the industry that once had his name on it for something steadier, something safer. He thought that chapter of his life was closed. He had no idea it was about to walk through the front door in a $5,000 dress. Elizabeth Vance entered the restaurant like someone who had never once worried about being told we're full. She was 42, CEO and majority shareholder of Vance Dynamics, the kind of executive business magazines loved photographing next to words like visionary and fearless. She'd built something real. Vance Dynamics had gone from a regional logistics company to a global name under her leadership. And somewhere in that climb, she'd convinced herself that success gave her the right to define the people around her however she wanted. That night she had one thing on her mind: finalizing details on Meridian, the platform she was about to unveil to the world as the crown achievement of her career. She decided, within about 60 seconds, that Marcus was beneath her notice. She never once used his name. She called him waiter, the way you'd call a chair a chair. When he offered a wine recommendation, she cut him off and asked him to name 3 vintages the restaurant didn't even carry, watching his face, waiting for the stumble. It never came. You speak awfully well, she said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, for someone doing this job. A couple of her advisors traded a glance. Nobody said anything. Her chief of staff, Claire Whitfield, felt that comment land wrong. She said nothing either. There was a contract on the line tonight, and she'd learned a long time ago which battles were worth losing her seat at the table over. Elizabeth kept going, because Marcus's calm was doing something to her that no mistake ever could have. She asked how many shifts a man his age needed to work to afford shoes like hers. She said she'd met people like him before. People who spend one nice evening in a nice room and start imagining they belong there. Marcus refilled her water without a word. Jaw tight, hands steady. Then she asked if his daughter was proud of him, or if she avoided mentioning to her friends that her father was just a waiter. That's the one that did it. Marcus set the wine bottle down. Slowly, deliberately. Glass meeting linen, was the only sound at the table. "Mock me again," he said, eyes locked on hers. "I dare you." Elizabeth smiled, the smile of someone who thought she'd finally gotten the reaction she wanted. "Let's not turn your unprofessionalism into a conversation about prejudice," she said. "I treat every member of staff exactly the same." "No," Marcus said, voice level. "You treat everyone badly. You just pick certain people to look down on more than others." Silence, forks resting untouched on porcelain. And that's when one of her advisors, trying to move things along, reached for a tablet on the table and angled it just enough for Marcus, standing a step behind her shoulder, to catch a clean look at the screen. A schematic, blue and white lines, labeled Meridian. He said nothing. He finished pouring water at the next table over, unhurried, giving himself time to look again without looking like he was looking. And there it was, buried in the corner of the diagram. One internal module name, a name he had coined 7 years earlier, back when this was nothing but code on his own laptop. He circled back, refilled glasses, looked once more, longer this time, confirming what he already knew. The way the data layers stacked. The exact placement of one particular variable, doing exactly the job he'd built it to do all those years ago. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a resemblance. This was his work, sitting in a slide deck for a product Elizabeth Vance was about to present to the world as hers. He waited until he was certain. Then he spoke, no threat in his tone at all, just the flat confidence of a man stating a fact. He said the system, as designed, would overreact to short-term market swings. He said it would misallocate inventory at scale, under exactly the wrong conditions. He said one small failure buried in that architecture could cascade into something much bigger, and that Vance Dynamics' biggest contract could collapse within its first quarter if nobody fixed it before launch. Elizabeth went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with composure. Because those 3 flaws, those were the exact 3 problems her technical team had spent 3 months trying to bury. The ones she'd been told were under control. Claire looked at Marcus differently now, discomfort sliding into disbelief. Elizabeth snapped back into her boardroom voice fast, demanding Tony fire him on the spot, threatening to pull every contract Vance Dynamics had with the restaurant group. Tony refused. Calmly, he explained that Marcus had only responded after being provoked. And that night, alone in his office, Tony quietly pulled the full security footage from the dining room camera. He saved it. He wasn't sure why yet. He just knew he needed to. By morning, Elizabeth had already started digging into the background of a waiter whose name she'd never bothered to learn. What she found stopped her cold. Marcus Cole, founding architect of Nextbridge Systems. The very platform Vance Dynamics had quietly acquired and folded into the foundation of Meridian. His existence threatened everything. The story she told investors, the image she'd built her reputation on, the legacy she'd spent years constructing around technology that was never entirely hers. Driving home that night, Marcus understood something simple. Elizabeth Vance was not going to let this go. He could stay quiet. Protect the small, ordinary life he'd rebuilt for Zoe. Let it fade, the way so many humiliations before it had faded. Or he could stand against a woman with money, media, and power, and risk everything he'd rebuilt since the day he signed his company away to save his daughter's life. He sat in his car in the lot behind his building, replaying the dinner. Not the insults themselves, the ease of them. Like she'd rehearsed that particular cruelty on 100 people before him, and none of them ever had a diagram to catch her with. He thought about Denise, about what she used to say, that dignity isn't something you prove to a room, it's something you refuse to let a room take from you. Inside, Zoe was already asleep on the couch, a half-finished math worksheet on her lap. He carried her to bed the way he had 1,000 nights before, careful not to wake her, careful to keep his hands from shaking. He sat alone in the dark kitchen after that, staring at the stove light reflected in the window, and understood something had already changed. The version of himself who could go back to work tomorrow and pretend nothing happened. That guy didn't exist anymore. The only real question left: who was going to control how this story got told? By morning, the story had already outgrown the dining room where it started. An 11-second clip had surfaced online. It began at the exact moment Marcus set the bottle down. Every comment Elizabeth made before that, the age, the daughter, the shoes, had been cut away. What was left was just a black man in a waiter's uniform, staring down a wealthy white woman, daring her to mock him again. It spread the way clips like that always spread. Fast. Context-free. Shared by people who never sat at that table and never would. Strangers called him aggressive. Bitter. A disgruntled ex-founder looking for attention. News anchors repeated the framing without questioning a word of it. Someone dug up an old conference photo of Marcus from his Nextbridge days and used it to suggest he'd been waiting for a moment like this. Nobody asked what happened before the clip started. Nobody seemed to want to know. Elizabeth appeared on camera that afternoon with the rehearsed sorrow of someone who'd practiced grief in a mirror. She called it an unfortunate service disagreement twisted into something about race. She said she took no pleasure in a working man's reputation suffering, but businesses had an obligation to protect customers from threatening behavior. She added, almost as an afterthought, that she'd always believed deeply in equality. In 4 sentences, she made herself the victim, erased everything Marcus had actually lived through, and turned a man who never raised his voice into someone the public should fear. Watching it later, Marcus felt something close to grudging respect for how effortlessly she pulled it off. The same steady voice she'd probably used in 100 boardrooms, now aimed at rewriting a story she'd started herself. Tony watched from the back office, arms crossed, jaw tight enough to ache. The unedited footage sat locked in his desk drawer. Every insult intact. It took real effort not to release it that same hour. He didn't. Not yet. He understood something Elizabeth clearly assumed nobody around her understood. Patience can be a weapon too. Use it too early, and it just gets dismissed as one more angry employee taking sides. Around the restaurant, the mood shifted before anyone said a word to him directly. A few coworkers gave him quiet nods in the hallway, careful not to be seen doing it. Others avoided him completely, unsure if standing too close would cost them their own shifts. Marcus didn't blame either group. Then it reached Zoe's school before he ever got the chance to explain it to her himself. A classmate told her that her father had threatened a billionaire and might go to jail. Language clearly borrowed from an adult who'd watched the same segment Elizabeth gave that afternoon. Another kid asked if her family was poor and angry about it. Zoe came home quiet in a way that scared Marcus more than tears would have. Backpack dropped by the door. Coat still on. "Did you really scare her?" she asked. No accusation in it. Just a 10-year-old trying to reconcile the father she knew with the man described on a stranger's phone screen. Marcus knelt to her level, the way he always did when something mattered enough to deserve his full attention, and told her the truth plainly. He hadn't threatened anyone. He'd refused to let a woman use his daughter to make him feel small. And he wasn't sorry for that, whatever the internet decided to call it. "She asked me things about you first," he said, before I ever said a word back. Nobody online is showing that part. But you know me. I need you to trust what you know over what a stranger's video says. She believed him, the way she always did. Then one more question, quieter than the first. Is it because we're not rich like her? He told her it had nothing to do with money, though he understood exactly why a 10-year-old watching adults fight about a billionaire would land there first. Some people, he told her, decide who matters before they ever learn anything true about them. That's not about what you have or don't have. Watching her walk her backpack back to her room, Marcus understood something had shifted for good. This wasn't only about his own dignity anymore. It was about whether his daughter would grow up believing the truth could win, or learning early that money and headlines just decide who gets believed. 2 days later, Claire called and asked to meet somewhere quiet, away from anyone who reported to Elizabeth. She found Marcus on a bench outside a small park near his building. Before he said a word, she apologized for her silence at dinner, admitted she understood exactly what was happening in real time, and chose the deal over speaking up. "I told myself the negotiation mattered more than staying quiet for one evening," she said. "That was a lie I needed to hear less than you needed to hear the truth." Marcus didn't soften it for her. "You didn't stay quiet because you didn't understand what was happening," he told her. "You stayed quiet because the contract mattered more to you than my dignity did, right up until it became inconvenient not to notice." She had no answer for that. To her credit, she didn't try to manufacture one. "Prejudice doesn't only live in the words of the person doing the insulting," Marcus added. "It lives just as easily in the silence of people who know something is wrong and decide speaking up is too inconvenient." She sat with that. Then she offered to testify publicly about what she'd witnessed, and offered him a position at her own firm, with a real title and real security behind it. Marcus turned it down without hesitation. You only started to see my value the moment you learned I understood technology, he told her. That's not the kind of respect I'm interested in collecting. I don't need a better version of what happened at that dinner. I need people to see the value in a man carrying trays the same way they'd see it in a man carrying a title. Claire accepted the correction instead of defending herself against it. From that point on, something between them shifted, from guilt into something closer to a real partnership. She started quietly digging through internal Vance Dynamics records, starting with version histories on the Meridian platform. What she found was suggestive but incomplete, fragments hinting at an older origin, without proof of who built it first. That's when Marcus told her, for the first time out loud, about the fingerprint he'd left behind in the original build 7 years earlier. Buried deep in the forecasting module was a validation string, a small piece of test code he'd written the same week Zoe turned 3, named after a phrase she used to repeat constantly back then. He'd written it almost without thinking, the same week he was signing his company away in a hospital conference room, needing something of hers close to the work, even as he let the work go. No public documentation described it. No outside engineer would ever think to look for it. Only the person who wrote it would know it existed at all. Claire traced it. Long nights after hours, combing through archived repositories, Vance Dynamics never expected anyone to examine that closely. Within days, she had a case far stronger than either of them had started with. Commit logs with his name buried in early history the company never fully scrubbed. Design documents matching his description down to the naming conventions he used out of habit, not standard. Hospital and legal records lining up perfectly with the week of the equity sale, the same week Zoe had surgery. And internal emails. Engineers had flagged the exact 3 flaws Marcus named at dinner, months earlier. Warnings quietly closed out by senior management. Warnings Elizabeth herself had received directly and ignored while publicly calling Meridian her singular achievement. Claire wanted to release everything immediately. Marcus stopped her. He had no interest in becoming a supporting character in a story the public would inevitably frame as a fight between 2 powerful women, erasing him a second time in the retelling. He agreed to move forward, but only on his terms. She could verify and organize the evidence. He would tell his own story, in his own words. Nobody, however well-intentioned, would speak for him. For the first time since the dinner, something like control came back into his hands. That fragile control didn't survive the week. Elizabeth's communications team leaked a report to financial outlets accusing Marcus of abandoning Nextbridge during a critical growth period, framing the equity sale as a self-interested exit instead of a father's desperate choice. No hospital, no heart defect, no 3-year-old on a surgical table. Just a bitter founder, weaponizing discrimination claims for sympathy and leverage. Reporters who'd never spoken to him quoted it as fact. Within a day, it hardened into the accepted version of events for anyone skimming headlines. Corporate clients started canceling events at the restaurant, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. Tony absorbed the hit himself as long as he could, before he had no choice but to cut hours for co-workers who'd had nothing to do with any of it. People Marcus had trained, watching their paychecks shrink over a dinner they hadn't even served. Marcus resigned before Tony ever had to consider letting him go. Walked into the back office one afternoon and set his apron on the desk without ceremony. "You've done nothing but protect me," he told Tony. "I won't let it cost you the people who work here." "This isn't finished," Tony said, shaking his hand like a business partner instead of an employee. "Whatever happens next, you call me first." The damage reached further than the restaurant. Marcus had spent 3 years quietly saving toward a small restaurant of his own, a modest place he planned to call Coal and Pine. He'd finally found a landlord willing to rent him a storefront in Brooklyn. That deal collapsed within a week. Vague concerns about liability, after the landlord read the same articles circulating about his past. 3 years of saving, gone over a single phone call, a voicemail he listened to twice alone, while Zoe's laughter drifted in from the next room. He found he couldn't even summon the anger the moment deserved. Just a tired kind of grief. Claire offered to buy the property through an intermediary and lease it back to him quietly, insulating him from any landlord's second thoughts. Marcus refused almost reflexively. He didn't want to owe anyone anything, especially not something that large. "Self-respect doesn't mean turning every offer of help into an insult," Claire told him, more directly than she'd ever spoken to him before. He didn't have an answer ready for that. He'd built his independence into something close to armor over the years. First out of pride, later, if he was honest, out of the memory of what it felt like to be used by people who claimed to be on his side back when Nextbridge was still his. Then came the lowest point. A reporter tracked down Zoe's school and cornered her in the schoolyard during recess, asking if her father hated Elizabeth Vance, if Claire was secretly paying him, if his family was trying to extort Vance dynamics for money. Firing questions faster than a 10-year-old could process any single one. She panicked. She ran, cutting across the sidewalk toward the street without checking for traffic, the way Marcus had taught her 100 times never to do. She didn't see the car until it was already braking, tires screeching against pavement, just short of where she stood frozen. She wasn't hurt. Not physically. But something in Marcus broke completely the moment he got the call and arrived to find her shaking on the sidewalk, a stranger's hand resting awkwardly on her shoulder. He carried her home wrapped in his coat, her small body trembling the whole way, and sat by her bed until she finally fell asleep. That night, alone in the kitchen, he pulled the folded blueprint for coal and pine out of the closet, packed it into a box with a handful of belongings, started preparing to leave the city entirely. If he simply disappeared, he told himself, Elizabeth would have no one left to attack. Zoe would finally be safe. She found him packing that box before bed and asked one question that stopped him cold. If she's the one lying, she said, standing in the doorway in her pajamas, why does she get to decide that we're the ones who have to leave? He had no answer. Not that night. The next morning, the blueprint was sitting exactly where he'd left it. Except now, something was written across the back in his daughter's handwriting. The place where Dad never bows to anyone. Careful 10-year-old letters. Some words crossed out and rewritten until she was satisfied. Marcus stood in the kitchen holding it for a long time, thumb running over the crossed-out words, understanding finally that running might keep Zoe safe for a while, but it would also teach her that people with enough power could win simply by lying loudly enough, for long enough. He thought about Denise. What she would have said, watching him pack that box. He suspected she'd have asked him the exact same question his daughter just had. He called Claire that morning. Then Tony admitted out loud for the first time that he couldn't manage this alone anymore, and that trying to had already cost more than he was willing to keep paying. Claire didn't celebrate. She just asked what he needed first. Tony's answer was simpler. Told you to call me first, he said. Now tell me what you need. Marcus agreed to accept their help, on the same terms he'd set from the start. Claire would verify and distribute the evidence. Tony would provide the full, unedited footage. Marcus himself would speak, in his own words, with nobody softening or sharpening the story on his behalf. And the goal was never going to be revenge. It was going to be the truth, spoken plainly, and whatever accountability followed it. For the first time in weeks, he slept through the night without checking his phone. Not because the danger had passed, because he'd finally let people who cared about his family carry part of the weight with him. Vance Dynamics held the Meridian launch inside a glass ballroom packed with board members, international investors, and financial press. Partners preparing to sign contracts worth more money than Marcus had earned in his entire career combined. Elizabeth walked onto that stage, intending to call the platform the greatest achievement of her life. For a few minutes, under lights built to make her look untouchable, she almost believed her own story again. Behind the scenes, the quiet machinery Marcus had agreed to was already moving. Claire had sent verified documents to select board members days earlier. The ones known for asking hard questions instead of following Elizabeth's lead. Marcus's name landed on the guest list through a contact who owed Claire a favor and asked no questions. Tony had already transferred the unedited footage to a handful of phones inside that room. Time to arrive quietly instead of all at once. Some board members had started asking quiet questions among themselves in the days before, uncertain what to make of rumors reaching them from more than one direction. Elizabeth spotted Marcus's name on the list before the doors even opened. She reacted exactly the way she always reacted to anything slipping outside her control, revoked his access immediately, locked down the presentation system, ordered security to remove him the second he appeared. When Marcus walked through the entrance in a plain gray suit, security closed in within seconds. Elizabeth seized the moment, turning to the room and announcing that this man had threatened her once already and was now forcing his way into a private event. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't pull away from the hands gripping his arm. "Did you ever see me as an engineer?" he asked, loud enough to carry across the room. "Before you knew my name?" Elizabeth said nothing. Her expression flickered before she smoothed it back into composure. "When I wore a uniform, you decided I couldn't understand technology," he continued. "When I pushed back against being insulted, you called me dangerous. When the evidence proved I built this platform, you called me a bitter man looking for attention." He turned slightly toward the board. "The problem was never that she didn't know who I was. The problem is she decided who I was allowed to be, the moment she looked at me." Security started moving him toward the exit. An investor near the front stood, one of several who'd already received Claire's documents, and asked the room to let him finish. Another guest confirmed openly that the circulating materials appeared authentic. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd that Elizabeth could feel even from the stage. Marcus began speaking from memory. Calm, precise, naming the original module structure, describing how data moved through the system's core layers, explaining the reasoning behind design choices he'd made years earlier, when the platform was just code on his own laptop. He named the same 3 flaws he'd named at dinner. And then, for the first time in public, he described the small validation string buried in the forecasting module, built around a phrase his daughter used to repeat at 3 years old. A Vance Dynamics engineer near the back straightened in his seat, recognizing every detail as technical language no outsider could have faked. Elizabeth tried to regain control, said he'd surrendered every right to the technology the moment he signed the sale papers, called him a waiter clinging to a past that didn't belong to him anymore, accused him of using prejudice as leverage. Marcus let her finish. Then he told the room, plainly, that he'd signed away his company inside a hospital conference room while his daughter waited 2 floors up for emergency heart surgery. "I lost a company," he said. "I kept my daughter. If I had to choose again tomorrow, I'd sign those same papers without hesitation." Elizabeth answered coldly that nobody came here to hear a waiter's personal story, and the words landed wrong the instant they left her mouth. The room shifted visibly around her. Claire, standing near the side of the ballroom, confirmed quietly that the documents had already reached the entire board. Tony sent the full footage to phones throughout the room within seconds. Elizabeth could lock the main screen. She couldn't lock every device in a room full of investors already reaching for their phones. Within minutes, the footage played silently across dozens of small screens at once. Guests watched Elizabeth refuse to use Marcus's name, watched her express open surprise that he could speak intelligently about business, watched her bring his 10-year-old daughter into an insult meant purely to wound him. A board member near the front called for the main screen to be unlocked. After a tense moment, someone complied, letting the footage play across the central display for everyone to see. The original design documents appeared beside it, projected for the room. Marcus turned to Elizabeth and asked her to explain the 3 structural flaws in the platform she'd spent months calling her personal achievement. She reached for corporate language, vague phrases about risk tolerance and market responsiveness. It didn't hold together under any real scrutiny. The Vance Dynamics engineer stood and confirmed, in front of the entire room, that Marcus understood the platform's architecture better than anyone currently employed by the company, that Meridian wasn't close to ready for deployment, and that internal warnings about these exact flaws had been raised and ignored months earlier. Elizabeth said nothing after that. For the first time in her career, money, position, and assumption failed to decide who deserved to be believed in that room. The board suspended the Meridian launch before the morning ended. Elizabeth was placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation into the platform's true origins, the suppression of internal warnings, and the media campaign built around a heavily edited video. News of the suspension broke within the hour, this time with far more context than an 11-second clip ever gave it. Outlets that repeated Elizabeth's version weeks earlier quietly walked it back. Vance Dynamics formally acknowledged Marcus as the platform's original architect within days, and offered him a substantial royalty agreement. He turned down the offer to return as chief technology officer, telling Claire privately he had no interest in inheriting an empire built on his own work. Elizabeth lost her position once the board confirmed she'd known the platform's true origins and kept building her public reputation on a story she knew was false. Nobody framed it as a woman losing to a man. Marcus made a point of correcting anyone who suggested otherwise. She was held accountable for looking down on a person because of his race and his job, for erasing another man's work, and for using her power to turn the person she'd wronged into the one who looked guilty. Vance Dynamics committed publicly to transparent crediting of employee contributions, a formal process for discrimination complaints, and a full review of its hiring and promotion practices. Marcus told Claire, quietly, over coffee a few weeks later, that policy changes were only ever a beginning. Real change had to come from how people actually chose to treat one another, day to day. He used part of his royalty agreement to set up a fund for Zoe's future, and the rest to finally open the storefront he once feared he'd lost for good. Coal and Pine wasn't a grand restaurant. Open kitchen. A small table in the corner where Zoe did her homework most evenings. A handwritten menu. A staff Marcus made sure was treated fairly from day one. Above the staff station, painted simply on the wall, "No one who walks into this room is smaller than anyone else in it." Marcus still worked the floor some evenings, greeting customers by name, the same way he always had. Not because he needed the money, but because he wanted his daughter to understand that the work itself had never made him small. He greeted everyone the same way, whether they came in expensive coats or work uniforms of their own, whether they ordered the most expensive dish on the menu or quietly asked if smaller portions cost less. One evening, setting the table together, Zoe asked if Elizabeth was a bad person. Marcus thought about it honestly before answering. "She did wrong things, and she had to answer for them," he said. "But hating her isn't the point. The point is we don't become like her." She asked how to avoid that. "You look at people before their skin, their uniform, their money, or their title," he told her. "And you speak up whenever someone's being made to feel small, even when speaking up costs something." Elizabeth once believed power meant making other people go silent. Marcus proved that real power was standing against injustice without letting anger turn him into the very thing he was fighting. Prejudice doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lives quietly in assumptions and glances, in the casual certainty of someone who's already decided who deserves to be heard. Fighting it was never about revenge. It was about bringing the truth into the light, demanding accountability, and building something better for whoever walks through the door next. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that quiet dignity can outlast even the loudest cruelty, hit subscribe and stay close for the next one. Because there are so many more people out there who never bowed to anyone, and their stories deserve to be told too. Thanks for watching until the very end.